Welcome to our deep dive into the psychology of evil. Ever wonder how regular people can end up doing terrible things? That's what we're going to dig into today. We're using The Lucifer Effect by Philip Zimbardo. It's a fascinating look at how good people can turn bad. Especially interesting is how Zimbardo's own life kind of shaped his research. Growing up in a rough neighborhood in the Bronx got him thinking about the dark side of human nature.
Yeah, it's amazing how our personal experiences can really influence the questions we ask. Like Zimbardo wanted to figure out how situations can push people to do things they'd never imagine. That's what led him to the Stanford Prison Experiment. It's one of the most well-known and controversial studies in psychology.
Okay, so the Stanford Prison Experiment. Zimbardo basically made a fake prison in the basement of Stanford. He randomly assigned students to be guards or prisoners. And what's crazy is how fast things got out of control.
Oh yeah, he really wanted to prove that it's not just about a few bad apples. He wanted to challenge that idea. He was more focused on the bad barrel, the idea that the system itself can be toxic and corrupt people. And the Stanford Prison Experiment, well, it provides some pretty disturbing evidence for that theory.
So tell me more about how the experiment actually went down. I know they even had the Palo Alto police do realistic arrests. That seems pretty intense.
He wanted to make it as real as possible, right from the beginning. They went and picked up the prisoners from their homes. They even handcuffed them and did the whole booking process. Imagine being a college student, just chilling at home, and suddenly the cops show up at your door, accusing you of armed robbery. That would be a total shock.
Yeah, I can't even imagine how unsettling that would be.
Exactly. Zimbardo used all these symbols of authority to create a really intense environment, like a psychological pressure cooker. From that point on, the lines between reality and the experiment start to blur.
It's like he set things up for de-individuation right from the start.
Exactly. De-individuation is when you lose your sense of self and become part of the group. And that can make you do things you wouldn't normally do by taking away their identities and putting them through those procedures. Zimbardo started that de-individuation process before they even got to the fake prison.
And then once they were inside the prison, things escalated even more.
Right.
I know the guards started acting super authoritarian and even cruel to the prisoners.
Yeah, it's scary how quickly it happened. Zimbardo talks about how the guards came up with their own rules, things that weren't even part of the original plan. They'd wake up the prisoners in the middle of the night for no reason. They made them clean toilets with their bare hands, just all kinds of humiliation and harassment.
It's like they were seeing how far they could push it, testing the limits of their power.
Exactly. And as we see in real prisons, that kind of dynamic can lead to some really bad things: abuse and dehumanization. Zimbardo argues that the prison environment itself, even a fake one, can foster these harmful behaviors.
It's really sad to read about how some of the prisoners broke down.
Yeah. One of the most powerful examples is prisoner at C612, Doug. He started fighting back against the guards, refusing to follow orders. So they put him in solitary confinement, and he ended up having a complete emotional breakdown. After just 36 hours, they had to let him go because he was so messed up. It just goes to show how quickly the situation could cause serious psychological damage, even in someone who seemed pretty tough.
It's also really disturbing to read about those degradation rituals, the things the guards did to humiliate the prisoners, like making them wear those gowns and only calling them by numbers. All that psychological abuse, it feels so deliberate.
Right. It was all about dehumanization, stripping away their individuality and dignity, making it easier to justify mistreating them. It creates a psychological distance between the abuser and the victim. And tragically, we see this same stuff happen in the real world when groups are dehumanized, whether it's because of race or religion or anything else that makes them different.
It's like those rituals gave the guards a way to excuse their behavior, a moral loophole.
Exactly. And Zimbardo's point is that it wasn't just about a few bad guys. He says the system, the bad barrel itself, was corrupting them. They weren't necessarily bad people to begin with, but the situation brought out their worst impulses.
That's a pretty sobering thought. Like any of us, given the right circumstances, could be capable of doing terrible things.
It is. It really makes you question what we think we know about human nature and how much control we really have over our actions.
So the experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, but they had to shut it down after just 6 days. Things got so out of control, it makes you wonder what would have happened if they had kept going.
Yeah, it definitely raises some ethical questions about this kind of research. Even Zimbardo admitted that he got too caught up in his role as prison superintendent. He lost sight of the potential harm to the participants. He later said that the study should have been stopped sooner. So it raises a lot of questions about the responsibility of researchers. when they're studying these powerful situational forces.
And even though it was just a simulation, the Stanford Prison Experiment has some scary parallels to real-world prison abuses. I mean, those trophy photos from Abu Ghraib come to mind.
It's impossible to ignore those similarities. Zimbardo talks about that connection directly. He argues that even a fake prison can create an environment where abuse becomes normal. It's a reminder that the potential for evil exists anywhere, where there are power imbalances and systems that allow abuse.
It's a scary thought to think about, like maybe we're not as civilized as we think. But besides the Stanford Prison Experiment, what other research does Zimbardo use to support his argument about situational forces and how they lead to evil?
Well, he talks about a lot of different studies from social psychology. They show how easily we can be influenced by group pressure and obedience to authority, even dehumanization, like he talks about Solomon Ash's conformity experiments, where they asked people to judge the lengths of lines, but there was a trick.
I think I've heard of those. They had actors in the group giving the wrong answers, right?
Exactly. And a lot of the participants went along with those wrong answers, even though they knew it was wrong. They'd rather be wrong than stand out from the group. It shows how much we need to belong and how powerful group norms can be, even when they're wrong.
So basically, we're wired to fit in, even if it means ignoring our own judgment. That's kind of unsettling.
It is. And it makes you wonder how we can learn to think critically and have the courage to resist those pressures, especially when everyone else seems to be going along with something that feels wrong.
Zimbardo also talks about Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, right? The ones where people were told to give electric shocks to someone else, even though it seemed like they were hurting them.
Those experiments are famous or infamous for a reason. They show how easily people obey authority figures, even when it goes against their conscience. The participants thought they were giving real shocks, and a lot of them kept going, even when the learner was screaming in pain, just because the experimenter told them to.
Wow, that's terrifying. It makes you wonder if anyone is really immune to that kind of influence.
It really does. It suggests that under the right circumstances, almost anyone could hurt another person if someone in authority tells them to.
So if we're so susceptible to conformity and obedience, what hope do we have of resisting those negative forces?
Well, that's where the idea of heroic imagination comes in. Zimbardo argues that we can train ourselves to resist by developing a strong sense of self and a clear set of values and the willingness to challenge authority.
So it's about being more aware of those situational forces and developing the mental and emotional tools to resist them.
Exactly. We can start by asking ourselves those tough questions. What would I do if I saw someone being bullied? How would I respond if my boss told me to do something unethical? Thinking through those scenarios in advance can help us prepare.
Like a mental rehearsal for doing the right thing, even when it's hard.
Exactly. It's about anticipating those situations and having the courage to act according to your values, even when it's uncomfortable or risky.
So far, we've been talking about how situational forces can lead to bad behavior. But can they also be used for good?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes. Zimbardo talks about the power of positive role models and how they can inspire us to act heroically. He also emphasizes the importance of creating environments that encourage good behavior, environments that foster cooperation and empathy and ethical behavior.
So instead of bad barrels that corrupt us, we need good barrels that bring out the best in us.
I like that analogy. It's about surrounding ourselves with people who inspire us to be better, people who model ethical behavior, and who challenge us to live up to our values.
I know Zimbardo talks about fostering a heroic imagination. Can you explain what he means by that?
He's talking about developing the ability to see ourselves as potential heroes, to imagine ourselves acting courageously in tough situations. It's about believing that we have the power to make a positive difference, even in small ways.
So it's not just about reacting to situations, it's also about actively looking for opportunities to do good.
Exactly. It's about being proactive, about looking for ways to help our communities, to stand up for what we believe in, and to make the world a little bit better through our actions.
It sounds like a shift in mindset, from being passive bystanders to being active agents of change.
That's a great way to put it. It's about understanding that we're not just powerless pawns. We can actually shape what happens through our choices and actions.
One thing that's been on my mind is the idea of personal responsibility. If our behavior is so influenced by situations, does that mean we're not accountable for our actions?
That's a tough question. And I think Zimbardo wrestles with it throughout the book. He acknowledges that situational forces are powerful, but he doesn't let us completely off the hook. He says we still have a responsibility to develop our character, to build our moral compass, and to resist negative influences as best we can.
So it's a balancing act between understanding the power of the situation and holding ourselves accountable for what we do.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're not always in complete control, but that we still need to try to do the right thing, even when it's hard.
So let's talk about some real-world examples of heroic action. What are some stories from the Lucifer Effect that stand out to you?
One that always gets to me is the story of the Rosenstrasse protests in Nazi Germany. These were incredible acts of courage and defiance by ordinary people who risked their lives to stand up for what they believed in.
I remember reading about those protests. They were amazing. It was a group of women protesting the detention of their Jewish husbands and sons, right?
Yes, they gathered in the streets day after day, demanding their loved ones be released. They faced down the Gestapo, risking arrest and even death. And in the end, they succeeded. Their courage and persistence shamed the Nazi regime into releasing the prisoners.
It's an incredible example of how ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they come together and refuse to be silenced.
Absolutely. It shows the power of collective action and how important it is to support each other in the face of injustice. It also highlights how, even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can prevail.
Another story I think of is that iconic image of the Tank Man from the Tiananmen Square protests in China. It's such a powerful image of individual courage against overwhelming force.
That image is burned into our minds for a reason. One man standing in front of a column of tanks, refusing to back down. We still don't know who he is, but his actions inspired people all over the world. He became a symbol of resistance against tyranny.
It's a reminder that even one person can make a difference, that even a small act of defiance can have a huge impact.
Absolutely. The Tank Man shows us that even when things seem impossible, courage and hope can win out.
I'm finding all these stories so inspiring. They're making me feel more optimistic about humanity.
Me too. These examples show us that heroism isn't just for superheroes. It's in all of us. It's about making those daily choices to speak up, to help others, to live according to our values.
Yeah, it's amazing to see those glimmers of hope, even in the darkest situations. It makes you realize how strong the human spirit can be.
Right. It's like Zimbardo saying, hey, I've shown you how bad things can get, but don't lose hope. We have the power to choose a different path. We can resist those negative influences and cultivate our own heroic potential.
So how do we do that? How do we cultivate that heroic imagination and become more like those inspiring people we've been talking about?
Well, it starts with understanding that heroism isn't something special. It's not a magical quality that only a few people have. It's a choice we make every day, in big ways and small ways. It's about developing certain habits of mind and heart, that make us more likely to act with courage and compassion and integrity when the time comes.
I like that. It takes the pressure off. It's not about being a superhero. It's about making those choices every day. To be a little braver, a little kinder, a little more willing to stand up for what's right.
Exactly. It's more attainable that way, more empowering. It's about building those heroic muscles through practice.
So what are some practical tips for building those heroic muscles? Where do we start?
Zimbardo talks about a lot of strategies, and a lot of them are things we've already touched on, about resisting negative influences. It starts with self-awareness, knowing your strengths and weaknesses, recognizing what triggers you, and being mindful of situations that make you vulnerable.
Right. Like knowing your kryptonite. What are the things that make me more likely to conform? Or obey an unjust authority? Or dehumanize others? Once I know those things, I can start to build defenses.
Exactly. It's about being proactive, anticipating those situations, and developing strategies for dealing with them. Maybe it's having a phrase you could use to challenge a prejudiced comment, or practicing saying no when someone asks you to do something unethical. The point is to have a plan, so you're not caught off guard.
Makes sense, like a mental rehearsal for those tough moments. But it also sounds like a lot of work.
It does take effort, but it doesn't have to be overwhelming. Start small. Maybe just be more mindful of the language you use. Make a conscious effort to avoid dehumanizing labels or stereotypes. Or maybe commit to doing one small act of kindness each day, like holding the door for someone, giving a genuine compliment, donating to a cause you care about.
Those are good ideas. They seem doable.
Exactly. The key is to make it a habit. Make those small acts of courage and compassion part of your daily life. Over time, they'll become second nature, and you'll start to see yourself differently.
Like you're building that heroic identity through your actions.
Exactly. You're not just acting heroically, you're becoming heroic. And when you see yourself that way, you're more likely to act accordingly.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. but in a good way.
Exactly. And the more you practice, the easier it gets. You build up that courage, that resilience, that confidence to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard.
You know, something else I've been thinking about is role models and mentors. We've been talking about people who did heroic things in extreme situations, but can we also find those heroic qualities in everyday people?
Absolutely. Heroism comes in all forms. It's not just about grand gestures or risking your life. It's about living with integrity and compassion and courage, even in the smallest ways.
So it could be a teacher who goes the extra mile for their students, or a nurse who treats every patient with respect, or a single parent who works hard to provide for their family.
Exactly. Heroism is all around us, often in the most ordinary places. It's about seeing those qualities in others
Yeah.
and letting them inspire us.
And I think it's important to remember that heroes aren't perfect. They make mistakes, they have flaws, they struggle, but they still choose to act, and that's what makes them so inspiring.
I agree. It's not about being superhuman. It's about being human with all our imperfections and still trying to do what's right, even when it's hard.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Lucifer Effect, what are the key takeaways you hope our listeners will remember?
Well, I hope they come away feeling like they have the power to make a difference, that they have agency, that they can choose their own path. Even in tough situations, we're not just victims of circumstance. We can learn to resist negative influences and cultivate our own heroic potential and make choices that create a better world.
I love that message of empowerment. It reminds us that we're not powerless, that we
No.
can make a difference.
And I also hope they remember that heroism isn't just for a special few. It's for all of us. It's about the choices we make every day to be a little braver, a little kinder, a little more willing to stand up for what's right. It's about recognizing that we're all connected and that our actions have an impact, even the small ones.
That's a beautiful thought. Thank you for sharing your insights today. It's been an amazing journey, exploring the dark side and the light side of human nature.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the fight for good never ends, and we all have a part to play. So go out there and be the hero you were meant to be.
That's a wrap on our deep dive into the Lucifer Effect. Until next time, keep those heroic imaginations